Hey guys, and welcome back to Monka, where sleep deprivation ensues, but yesterday I wrapped up playing a game, or I should say really I beat the campaign of a game. I'm not quite done with it yet because I feel like I'm going to be playing this game a lot, but I did beat the campaign and play a bit of extra content, so I kind of wanted to give my impressions on it, I guess. Yesterday I beat Prodeus, specifically the Nintendo Switch version. This game originally came out in early access on Steam in 2020. It saw a full release in 2022. That also brought it to the Xbox One and Xbox Series X, as well as the PS4, PS5, and of course the Nintendo Switch. The Switch version got, as I understand, it got a digital release in 2022. The physical releases were in April of 2023. The game is developed by Bounding Box and published by Humble Games. The game is, in short, what I would describe as kind of a retro shooter. It definitely has influences of Doom throughout it, as it has a graphical aesthetic that would compare to the original Doom. However, it controls more like Doom 2016, but the campaign in total took me somewhere in the ballpark of around 6 to 7 hours to beat, and as well, I've been playing a ton of custom content and custom maps for the game, which we'll get into once we get into the gameplay. But in short, Prodeus is a really fun little retro shooter, to be honest. This isn't really a category of games I get into often, these kind of boomer shooters as they're called nowadays, kind of retro FPS games that throw back to things like Doom, Duke Nukem, Quake, and games like that. Really, I don't play those games that often, but Prodeus is pretty damn good, to be honest. I can highly recommend it. I paid $30 for the physical version. I think it's $30 for digital as well, but it's definitely worth it because honestly, this game's a decent amount of fun. Like I said, for the campaign, it's about 6 to 7 hours long, which isn't too terribly long, but it's also about the average, I would say, for an FPS. But as well, the custom content is what really makes this game stand out because there's a ton of custom content that makes this game highly replayable. But in terms of the graphics and performance, this game has pretty cool graphics, to be honest. The game kind of has a split in its graphical style. Things such as enemies or weapons, pickups, or things like explosive barrels and stuff like that are all done sprite based. So enemies are sprite based, your weapon animations are sprite based, and as well pickups in the environments are also sprite based, which is really cool, to be honest. It gives it kind of like that retro feel like I was talking about. It really is a throwback to Doom because it does have kind of like that low frame rate reload and the low frame rate deaths that kind of Doom had. It looks really cool, and for the graphical aesthetic, I kind of really dig it. It's kind of unique for, honestly, a game like this, especially considering the environments are kind of 3D, but they're pixelated. The game has a lot of cool things going on in graphics. The only thing I can really complain about is the fact that the game is really dark, to be honest. Even though it feels like it's kind of trying to throw back to the original Doom, it kind of takes after Doom 2016 the fact that the game is just really dark, and so sometimes it makes it hard to see things. Other than that, though, the graphical aesthetic for the game is really cool. I like the pixel-based style mixed with the kind of 3D environments. It's a really unique take on graphics, and I really dig it. Even though I usually say I don't really give a shit about the graphics, these graphics are actually pretty cool, to be honest, so I give them props for that. Now, in terms of the performance, the game holds pretty stable performance on the Nintendo Switch for the most part. I would say it runs around 30 frames per second, depending on how much detail levels have. Some levels will run at a consistent 60 frames per second, but the more shit they have in it, the closer it gets to 30 FPS, with occasional frame dips as well, depending on what level it is. It's very occasional that frame dips happen. I don't recall it happening in the campaign. However, in custom maps, it is very prone to happening because the custom maps are across all consoles, and so obviously with the Switch being the most underpowered one, some of these maps will run the worst on the Nintendo Switch, but that is no fault of the developer at all. So in terms of graphics, they're really cool. I like the sprite-based graphics that they use for enemies and weapons and stuff like that, and as well the 3D environments with their pixelated graphics look really cool as well, and the performance is pretty good as well. Just know if you're playing it on the Switch, there will be frame drops or lower frame rates for some of the custom maps. But in terms of the music and sound design, the music is pretty cool, to be honest. The music is very reminiscent, to me at least, of Doom 2016. Like I said, this game feels very much like it was inspired by the entire Doom franchise because the music is very much the same. It has this very laid-back soundtrack when no action is popping off, and then kind of like in Doom 2016, when shit starts popping off, the music just ramps up and matches the energy of all the shit that's going on screen. It is just tense, and it just makes the atmosphere, because when bullets start flying, the music just ramps up and just starts going crazy with this like heavy metal soundtrack. So I'm not really into all that much of heavy metal, but I can really appreciate the kind of soundtrack that it has because it really gets you amped when bullets start flying and enemies just start going crazy. But the soundtrack very much sets the mood for this game, and it very much does its job because when it's chill, it has the very kind of grimy but kind kind of laid back sound to it, but when it amps up and it really gets you pumped and really puts you into the moment of all the intensity going on in the gameplay. But I usually make a mention in my videos about voice actors. There is no voice acting in this game, so it's going to be kind of a point that I skip over. But in terms of the sound design is pretty good, to be honest. I like the sound design of like the enemies like grunting or like your character grunting, but as well when there's shit happening like explosions and shit, it sounds really good. As well, it also has a blood splatter sound effect when you like blow up enemies. The sound design just really makes this game feel really satisfying with everything that's going on. But as well, the weapons all have a good sound design. They all sound really punchy and they really do their part, especially with things like shotguns. Shotguns sound really good in this game, and so the punchy weapon sound design mixed with like the visual flair of like blood splattering everywhere, as well as you can hear the sound of like blood splattering on the walls and everything, it really makes this game satisfying. And so in terms of the sound design, they really nail it because it really makes the gunplay feel satisfying and everything sounds pretty great. But in terms of music and sound design, the music is pretty good, to be honest. It does its part for sure. For when the action ramps up, it just goes all out and it really helps to make the intense moments pretty intense. Like, this game is pretty intense feeling at points, but the music definitely does its job for those intense moments. As well, the sound design overall is just really satisfying and really just elevates the game as well as the gunplay. Now, in terms of story and characters, this is going to be a point I'm going to skip over because there's really nothing much to talk about. I know absolutely nothing that happened through the story, so I won't act like I did. At the same time, it's a shooter, and that was really never my focus. I was just enjoying the action moment to moment. I really wasn't paying attention to any type of story. It's pretty much non-existent anyways, but that's not really a problem because, like I said, it's a shooter and I really don't care. And like I said, the characters are not really existent either. You play as some sort of soldier maybe, and other than that, I don't really know a story. But story and characters are going to be a point that I'm going to skip over because really there's just not much to mention. But in terms of the gameplay, which is the meat and potatoes of this game, the main part of the game is the campaign. Like I said, the campaign takes about 7 hours in total. As well, there's a multiplayer, which nobody really plays, to be honest, but that's alright because I don't know if this would have been really an engaging multiplayer that people would have got into, but anytime I tried to play the multiplayer, nobody was on, so I don't really have an opinion about it. The campaign is pretty good, to be honest, in terms of the level design. The levels are actually designed pretty well and are pretty well thought out, to be honest, for the campaign. They have a ton of secrets. The levels are all very unique in their design and they're all very different and they're all very fun to play through, to be honest. There's a lot going on throughout the levels in terms of like enemy varieties and weapon drops and everything, and like I said, secrets. So the levels are designed pretty well. They can be kind of one note at points when you're traveling through certain areas, but otherwise the levels are pretty good in terms of the design for the campaign. If you like secrets, there's a ton of secrets stuck within these levels, so you'll be able to do a lot of secret exploring if you like that. Now, I didn't do a lot of that. I was just kind of focused on playing through the campaign and enjoying it without doing too much secret hunting, but just know if you like secret hunting, there's a decent amount of that in this game. But the campaign takes 6 to 7 hours long, and overall it's pretty enjoyable. I can only complain about the fact that later in the game it feels kind of cheap because they'll throw you into arena settings where they'll just throw a ton of enemies at you, and especially later in the game when you get the tougher enemies, they'll just throw you into an arena setting with a ton of tough enemies, and you'll probably end up dying because that's just the outcome that'll happen. But that does get kind of frustrating when you get into these situations where you feel like it's an unwinnable scenario. The game does have checkpoints, so that kind of does mitigate, but it is kind of frustrating when you get into those situations where you just feel like you're going to die and there's nothing you can do about it. But the checkpoint system is kind of weird while we're on the topic because you do have a checkpoint system within the game, but every time you restart at a checkpoint, you really just respawn right back in at the checkpoint and all the enemies you killed stay dead. So it's pretty much a checkpoint system where you just respawn right back in instead of like restarting an arena situation or anything. Some people will be kind of weird about that and maybe not like it, but I didn't really mind it at all. But just know that when you respawn in at a checkpoint, the enemies do not respawn in. So in some scenarios, if you have like 20 enemies in an arena and you killed like 15 of them, those 15 won't respawn. You'll just have 5 left to kill. But that might be weird for some people, but for me it was fine. But in terms of the enemies, enemy AI isn't all that smart, but to be honest, it's meant to be like a Doom game. So the AI in the original Doom isn't all that smart, and in this game it's not that smart either. Now, the enemies do have a decent amount of variety. That being said, like I said, since it's so heavy on its Doom inspiration, a lot of the enemies feel like Doom enemies. So there's like the typical zombie, and then there's the shotgun zombie, there's imps, there's flying projectile enemies, and as well there's a minigun enemy. There's a decent variety of enemies that'll keep you on your toes, but like I said, since it's so heavy on the Doom inspiration, a lot of them feel like enemies you'd expect from something like Doom, but they do have a decent amount of variety. Later in the game, you'll get harder varieties of these enemies known as Proteans or Prodeus enemies. These enemies can be kind kind of frustrating because they take more bullets, and when you get thrown into an arena situation with them, it feels like kind of unfair because you'll just have to douse these enemies with bullets since they're such bullet sponges. But even on normal difficulty in arena situations with these enemies, it was fairly frustrating because they're just bullet sponges that can do a lot of damage, and they'll just fuck you up real quick and you'll probably end up dying. But other than that, the enemies are pretty cool. I enjoyed the variety nonetheless. They do give you a decent amount of variety. But one thing I'll say is that the movement system feels a lot like Doom 2016. Even though it looks like it harkens a lot back to the original Doom, the movement set feels a lot like Doom 2016, and it's very fluid, so it feels very good. Since you can get upgrades like double jumps and a dash ability, you do have a decent amount of mobility. Now that's later in the game, of course, but you do get a decent amount of mobility with double jumps and dashing. There is no crouching within the game, but the controls do feel pretty tight, to be honest, and I can appreciate that for sure, especially since you can be doing some platforming throughout the game. I'm appreciative of the fact that they do have tight controls. But the last thing to mention are the guns and gunplay, and the gunplay feels pretty great, to be honest, just due to everything going around it. That includes sound design and graphics and all of that, but there is a lot of weapons to choose from here, and they all feel pretty great. Now there's some basic ones like a pistol that has a burst fire mode for its all fire. It's actually a pretty great pistol, to be honest. It has a great sound design, but as well there's weapons like dual SMGs which allow you to absolutely shred enemies. There's a minigun, there's several different types of shotguns including a pump action, one that has 4 barrels on it like a quad barrel shotgun, and then there's an automatic shotgun, and as well there's a rocket launcher, grenade launcher. There's a ton of weapons in this game and they all feel really satisfying. Mainly the shotguns. The shotguns feel great in this game, especially when you get close range to an enemy and you just pump them full of lead. They'll just gore and they'll explode into like a fountain of blood, and it's immensely satisfying the way the game does it. So the game has really satisfying gunplay. Whether you're mowing enemies down with dual SMGs and blowing them up into blood, or shooting them with rockets and having them explode into fountains of blood, by the way, that splatters onto you and the walls and just covers everything. I mean, they really made the gunplay satisfying in this game, whether it's the way the weapons handle or the fact that enemies just explode into mountains of blood, or the fact that the sound design and everything surrounding it just makes the guns feel really good. The gunplay is just really tight and satisfying in this game, and I can really appreciate that. Even though everything around it kind of looks like the original Doom, it really feels like a modern, well thought out shooter in terms of the gunplay. But all of that considered, the only other thing really to mention is the custom maps. The custom maps are where this game is going to keep its longevity, I believe, and is really why I wanted to play this game so heavily, because the custom maps are really cool, and what people are doing with the custom maps is really cool. There's well over, probably I'd say maybe 500 custom maps within the game, considering it's been out in early access for around 3 years now. There are a ton of custom maps to play through, and there is a lot of creativity going on in there that can be really appreciated. Now there are some shitty custom maps, but that's of course to be expected, but there are some really cool ones as well. Some of the ones I remember off my head were that someone recreated Hollywood from Duke Nukem 3D, which was a really cool level, and as well someone created Peach's Castle from Mario 64, which was really cool as well. There were also some really cool original level designs as well, but the custom maps is really why I'm going to keep playing this game, why I'm going to keep coming back to it, because it's such a cool thing to allow, especially allowing Switch players, and I think pretty much all console players, to play the custom maps. That is really cool, and honestly it's going to keep me coming back to this game, but I can truly appreciate that. It feels like a Doom version of Mario Maker, and that's really appreciable. But overall, the gameplay is really solid, whether it's in terms of the solid weapons and gunplay, or the solid map design, or whether it's in terms of the fact that the game has custom maps that prolong the longevity of the game. Everything in terms of gameplay is solid within this game, but overall, Prodeus is really cool. I don't really get into boomer shooters that often, but to be honest, this is definitely one worth playing because of the fact that the graphics are cool, and because of the fact that the music is good, and because of the fact that the gunplay and gameplay and everything around that is really good, and the fact that it has a lot of longevity because it has custom maps. This game is high value for money, just because the content within it is good, but as well on top of that, the game is getting custom content that makes it even more value for money because it just adds more content, and in theory, infinite replayability. But I highly recommend playing this game, especially for $30. It's definitely worth the price tag. I think the game is on Game Pass if you want to try it, and if it is, I definitely recommend it. But this is definitely a game worth playing. Even if you don't get into boomer shooters, like I said, I don't really get into them, but I really found a lot of enjoyment in this game. But thank you very much for watching. Until next time, I'll see you. Stay chill.